Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible, right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I'm William Bell, and with me is the illustrious Dr. Don Preston. Don, how are you doing today?
Who was that? I don't know. You talking about somebody else there, William? Doing just fine, William. Really a hectic day. Not a pleasant day, I must say. As I was sharing with you just before we came on air, I had to spend most of the day yesterday afternoon moving stuff from one shop to another, and I did something that my back really didn't like. My back decided to take a trip into the next county, and I had to go to chiropractor this morning, and my sciatic nerve in my right leg has just been killing me ever since. Even the chiropractor didn't get it to settle down. So not been a happy day today, I can tell you. I've spent a good part of the afternoon on the ice pack trying to get it to calm down, but so far it hadn't worked.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I've had just busy, issues going on, just, trying to take care of things here and there, ripping and running all over town. And by the time you get through doing that for half a day, at least at this point in my life, it just drains me totally. As a matter of fact, just getting in shortly, just a few minutes ago. And I had to take a quick nap just before, getting on the air, because I knew that I wasn't going to make it if I didn't. But other than that, I'm doing fine. Things are going well. Been having some great studies, and just really excited about what's going on.
Well, the same here. I had a great conversation with a fellow on the phone yesterday. He called me up really just to ask and to solicit prayers on his behalf. He said, I have been attending this church for a little while. He said, there's certainly a futurist church. He said, I've tried not to make waves, but he said, I speak up in class every once in a while, and I ask questions every once in a while. And he said, I shared with the preacher. Now, I don't know exactly what his church affiliation is, to be honest about it. He never really got into specifics except their futurist church. But he said that he shared with the preacher what he believed. And he said the preacher seemed to be in an awful lot of agreement with what he was saying, and said he'd like to get together and study with him. But then this last Sunday, the preacher was going across some point on the book of Revelation, and he said, that's where I stand. He said, I challenge anybody to prove me wrong. And he said, so I thought, well, okay, the gauntlet has been thrown. So he said, I went up to the preacher afterwards and said, I'd like to accept your challenge. I'd like to talk about those things that you addressed. So as it turns out, yesterday he was supposed to have a get-together study with not only the preacher but the leaders of the congregation. Now, he didn't call them elders. He didn't call them, pastors or what have you. So I'm not real sure of what his church affiliation was or is, but he was more than a little concerned that they were not going to treat him kindly, and was calling to basically solicit prayers on his behalf. Haven't heard back from him yet, but I told him, I said, I certainly want you to call back. I want you to give us a little bit of feedback, a little bit of information on how things go, and to see if you have been disfellowshipped, disbarred, or just exactly how it goes. And so I'm still waiting to hear from him.
Well, good. Hearing about individuals who are learning about, this, and then some of them are just moving straight into dialoguing with others. And, that's really, really good that he's willing to do that at this point. I don't know how long he's been studying it, but, for him to acknowledge that he is now is a big step to take to begin with. And then to have to face, some of the things that, would be faced along the way, and then be willing to get out there and, get his feet, and hands dirty to get involved in, some of the conversations that will definitely have to take place once you state that. So that's good, and of course, we'll pray for him and hope that everything will go well.
Well, he told me, he said, I'm just tired of being quiet. I am tired of sitting there on my hands and not sharing what I believe to be the truth, knowing all the time that it's probably not going to be accepted, and I don't know anyone else near me that accepts preterism. So he said, I really honestly don't know what the result is going to be, but he said, I do know that I'm tired of keeping quiet. And he said, I just don't think that it's proper for me to sit there believing that I have the truth and refusing to share it in any way whatsoever. So he said, when the preacher issued that challenge, I dare anybody to prove me wrong, I thought, well, there's the open door. I said, well, I think you're exactly right. I said, if the preacher issued a challenge and did so in a gentlemanly type of way, I said, it sounds to me like it's an invitation to dialogue, an invitation to study. And he said, that's how I'm looking at it. And he said, that's how I'm going to approach the whole thing. Said, may get in there and discover he had no intentions whatsoever of being proven wrong. But he said, we won't know until we get down to it. I said, well, God bless. I hope it goes well with you.
Very good, very good. Well, we got, stories that are brewing on this side as well. We've got a class going on. We're into the third week of that class, and man, they're like marathons, and then we have a good 30 minutes of Q&A afterwards, so that's good.
Great.
Expecting, another country, if you please, to kind of be opened up as a result of this class. And, I'm hopeful that it does, because I certainly like to travel there. I'm not going to say anything about it at this point, but that's a possibility. So looks like it could be very promising on that end.
Well, as we have discussed so very often, doors are opening literally all over the world. There's absolutely no question about it. We hear these reports on a weekly, if not daily basis of individuals that have come to these views, whether on the internet or finding a track or whatever it is. And they are just absolutely hungry to know more. And they are eager to share this message with others. I couldn't help but be amused, William. Kenneth Gentry recently wrote an article, I Am Not a Preterist. We've talked about it just a little bit on this program. And he said that he supposes that he'll go ahead and keep on using that term preterist, even though he's looking upon it with disdain, But he said, well, the only good thing about it is that the preterist movement is so small that it's really insignificant. And Sam Frost chimed in the comment section, egging him on and urging him on and talking about how small the preterist movement is and that he daily interacts with people who are leaving the preterist movement. And I thought to myself, and I even posted. I attempted to post it. Let me rephrase that. This was a week and a half ago. I wrote my comment. I submitted it for posting, and I checked today. It has not been posted. But my response to him, to Dr. Gentry, was that he is sadly mistaken if he thinks covenant eschatology is not growing. Sam Frost simply is whistling by the graveyard when he says that covenant eschatology is not growing. And furthermore, Dr. Gentry, since you're currently writing a book on the Olivet Discourse to prove that it is a divided discourse, I would be more than happy to have a 2-hour formal YouTube debate with you on this subject. So please respond. Well, like I said, that was a week and a half ago when I typed that response. And, of course, it has to be moderated. They approve or disapprove. If they approve, it gets posted. If they don't approve, evidently, it doesn't get posted. Well, my challenge and my comments have not been posted. Well, today I posted an article on my website, DonKPreston.com and BibleProphecy.com, about Dr. Gentry's article and about his hermeneutic and about his claims and about me posting my article, my response, which has never gotten posted, and my debate challenge. So we'll see if Dr. Gentry will have anything to say about my response to his article on his website, whether or not my comments get posted. I already know the answer to my debate challenge. I already know the answer to that. Dr. Gentry has no interest whatsoever in debating me. He knows very good and well, as I've stated before, if he were to get on a debate platform with me or if he were to get in a YouTube debate with me, he would be debating his own hermeneutic that I have demonstrated over and over and over and again. And William, you've heard it said. You've read people who have contacted you. You've talked to people personally face-to-face who have told you that they began their studies, their eschatological studies, with the writings of Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, Joel McDermott, etc., and it was their hermeneutic, it was their writings that got them on the path to becoming full preterists, that they very quickly saw that the hermeneutic of Dr. Gentry, Gary DeMar, etc., leads inexorably right straight to the true preterist movement. Now, I know those men just hate to hear that said. I know Kenneth Gentry denies that is the truth. But I've had hundreds of people tell me that it was Kenneth Gentry's writings that led them to the full preterist view. And I know you've had the same thing happen to you. A person can just go to Dr. Gentry's writings. You can see his hermeneutic at work. You can apply it to the very verses that he tries to set still off in the future, and you can show the fallacy of that application based on his own hermeneutic. And that's problematic for him. It's problematic for any futurist view when you can take their hermeneutic and turn it against them. You know, I had a radio debate some years ago with a guy named Brian Schwertley, a rather caustic young minister. And I had found an article by him written online. The article was actually quite good on Matthew chapter 24. And he said he gave a 4-point hermeneutic for determining that Matthew chapter 24 had to apply to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Number one, audience relevance. Jesus was speaking specifically to his living apostles, telling them they would see the events that he was talking about. Number two, the use of apocalyptic language, that the language of the Lord coming on the clouds with a shout, in flaming fire, with the sound of a trumpet, etc., is typical Old Testament language that's not to be taken literally. Time statements. When you see any kind of a time statement that indicates that the event was imminent or at hand, it cannot apply to an event 2,000 years later. I've forgotten at the moment what his fourth point of hermeneutic was. But in our debate, shortly appealed to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 as absolutely proof positive that the full preterist view is wrong. When it came my time to speak, I said, I'm really thrilled that Brian Shortley decided to discuss 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I said, what I'm going to do in my presentation is I'm going to use Brian Shortley's own hermeneutic that is to be found at the following website. I cited the website. I cited the 4 principles that he gave, and I illustrated from 1 Thessalonians 4, from the text, that Brian Shortley's own hermeneutic demanded a first century fulfillment. I could sense the temperature rising while I was on the phone. When it was his turn to speak, he literally exploded in a caustic tirade against me. These men are nothing but damnable heretics, false teachers, and they are doomed to hell. And I mean, he spent the entirety of his presentation throwing out these kind of accusations, epithets, name-calling, caustic verbiage. Well, when I got back on, I just made the comment. I said, you know, folks, I said, it has been my experience in many, many, many debates that when a man has seen his doctrine exposed right before his very eyes, when it has been shown definitively that he is wrong, he has one of 2 or 3 options. Number one, he can admit that he was wrong. Number two, he can say, I don't know how to answer that. Or number 3, he can get downright ugly. Start calling names, questioning the integrity of his opponent, exactly like Brian Shortley has done. And I said, I want everyone to take particular notice that I used his own hermeneutic. Now, if Brian wants to get back on and say he rejects that hermeneutic, then that's fine, but he has to tell us why. Why it's valid on Matthew 24, but it's not valid in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So I'm going to challenge Brian Shortley in his next response to tell us whether or not he rejects his own hermeneutic. Number 2, if he does, to tell us why. Number 3, explain to us why his hermeneutic is not applicable in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, based upon the points that I've shared with this audience that are exactly the points that Brian Shortley proves or says proves a first century application of Matthew 24. Well, in his next presentation, he just continued his ugly, caustic, hateful name-calling. And that was pretty much the end of the debate. But when we're confronted with evidence, we have a choice to make. I was visiting with my friend from Israel, and we were talking about this very attitude. And he was being very complimentary of my videos. As a matter of fact, he said he had been watching my YouTube videos. He had been watching some of my debates. He had been on my websites. And I'm thinking, well, okay. But anyway, one of the things that he said was that I appreciated so very, very much was he said, I detect in you a man that is willing to change his mind if the evidence is there. I said, that's one of the foundations of my entire life. I said, if a person is not willing to change his mind, not willing to change his views, even when the evidence demands it, then they're not an honest person. We spent 45 minutes on the phone, William, having an absolutely fantastic conversation about Jewish history, Jewish law, on and on it goes. We were just discussing tons of stuff that is both fascinating and significant. Now, we didn't get into the full application of the significance. Both of us could see the train coming, for him especially, on the things that we were discussing. So we just didn't push that envelope. But we had an open, frank, friendly dialogue about lots and lots and lots of different ideas. And all of this, folks, has to do really honestly with the subject we've been covering over the last few weeks, several weeks now, and that's the subject of the Messianic Temple. I cannot tell you the number of times down through the years that I have encountered people that were just adamant that there has to be a yet future literal physical temple rebuilt in Jerusalem, number one, at the beginning of the tribulation, number two, at the beginning of the millennium, 7 years later. And a quick anecdote here, William. When I was still the minister at the East Main Church of Christ in Shawnee, Oklahoma, one Sunday night after services had just been dismissed, I was in the hallway, and I looked up, and here comes a guy, and I must be honest, I prejudged him because of his appearance. He really had the appearance of a street man, a homeless person. A full beard halfway down his chest. His hair was unmanaged. His clothes were disheveled. And I thought, oh, boy, here we go. Here's going to be a benevolent case. I need money. I need food. And he walks up to me and extended his hand. He said, you're Don Preston, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir, I am. Shook his hand. And he said, well, I'm the son of, and he called the name of one of our members there, one of our very, very faithful ladies, widow ladies. And he said, I want to issue a challenge to you. I said, okay. What is that challenge? He said, if you could prove to me that the kingdom is already established, that Jesus is sitting on the throne, ruling forever, that the Messianic Temple has been rebuilt, I'll be baptized. And I said, really? That's an interesting challenge. He said, well, I've got to tell you now, I am a dyed-in-the-wool dispensationalist. He said, I have been following Hal Lindsey. I've been following, or he named off some of the leading dispensationalists. He said, I've been reading their books diligently. I follow their ministries. And he said, I'm telling you right now, I do not believe that you're right. But he said, you can show me where the kingdom has already been established. The kingdom is here. The Messianic Temple is the church. And he said, I'll be baptized without any doubt. I said, I accept that challenge. When do you want to start? We studied for 4 weeks. I could tell that he was, in fact, very, very thoughtful. He was also very well studied. He was right. He had read the writings of all the leading dispensationalists. Trouble of it was, even though he had read a lot of Bible verses, he didn't know hermeneutic. He did not know how the New Testament interprets the Old. When I got there for the 5th study, we were only about halfway through, as I remember it, with what I had planned to develop that night. And he said, okay. I said, okay, what? He shut his Bible, closed it on the table, and shoved it back. And I thought, well, okay, here we go. Study is over. The mind is closed. I'd prejudged him. I said, what does that mean? He said, I'm ready to be baptized. I said, really? He said, you've shown it to me. It's clear as day. I have been deceived. He said, there's no question about it. The kingdom is here. And he said, those in Christ are in the kingdom. We become part of the Messianic kingdom. He said, it's plain as day. I've just never seen it before. He said, when can I be baptized? And I said, you can be baptized right now. So we did. We took him to the building right then and there. It was about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, and I baptized him. So it takes that kind of a heart for us to re-examine our traditional views, no matter what the subject is, folks. It doesn't matter whether it's the Messianic Temple. It doesn't matter if it's the coming of the Lord. It doesn't matter if it's the land promises made to Israel. It really, honestly, doesn't matter what the subject is. It may be the resurrection. It may be our concept of the body that was to be raised. If we're not willing to rethink, if we're not willing to re-examine, then guess what? Number one, we're never going to grow. And number two, we're never going to change. And number three, chances are we're never going to know the truth. And so a whole lot of our appeal on this program, folks, is for people, and by the way, William and I have said this many, many times, and we mean it sincerely. We are willing to change. The evidence has got to be really, really good, because you see, we've been in the futurist camp. We were trained in it. We were indoctrinated in it. I personally debated against dispensationalism from the amillennial perspective. So as the old saying goes, been there, done that, got the T-shirt when it talks about futurism. We also know why we left. We also know why we changed. We know why we rejected that position. So for somebody to just simply jump up, I had somebody text me yesterday morning. Don, you are wrong on the 70 weeks of Daniel, chapter 9. They ended in AD 34-35. And I wrote back and I said, well, I guess you know that doesn't prove anything. You've got to provide the evidence. And some people get offended when you ask for the evidence. You're just supposed to accept their testimony, accept their declaration that you're wrong, and accept the position that they tell you is right without having any evidence for it. And they get offended if you ask for the evidence. But that's not what we're about here on Two Guys in the Bible. We're all about the evidence. We're all about the testimony of Scripture. We're all about proper hermeneutic. We're all about proper exegesis. That's why we've been spending so much time in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, demonstrating to you, number one, the context and the framework is the last days. The specific time of fulfillment is not only the last days, but it's the day of the Lord that consummates the last days. And during that last days period of time, as we have shown you from Isaiah chapter 3, 1 and following, those last days period would be against Judah and Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, and verse 7. I mean, it's specific, it's emphatic, it's explicit that in that day, which is specifically the day of the Lord, at the climax of the last days, in that day the Lord would remove the stay and the staff of Israel, the bread and the water. This is a time of famine. So all of that said kind of brings us back full circle to what we have been trying to share with you. And that is, and by the way, I think that's verse 8, not verse 7, that it would be Judah and Jerusalem. Yeah, Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord to provoke the eyes of his glory. Now, Isaiah then proceeds to describe the attitude of Israel. And he says, the show of their countenance witnesses against them. They declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe to their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. This verse, now I want to make it perfectly clear that he is giving us a metaphor. They declare their sin as Sodom. He doesn't say they are Sodom. However, back in chapter 1, verses 15 and following, the Lord addressed the leaders of Israel, the leaders of Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear unto the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now, wait a minute. Who's he talking to? He's talking to the leaders of Jerusalem. What does he call them? Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, wait a minute, folks. He doesn't use the language of metaphor here. He uses the language of identity. The language of identity is Jerusalem has become Sodom and Gomorrah. Now remember, Isaiah chapter 2 is a projection all the way into the last days and the day of the Lord. And it compares them as Sodom. But historically, right there in Isaiah's day, Jerusalem is referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah. So, we have the contemporary Jerusalem as Sodom and Gomorrah, and we have the last days Jerusalem as Sodom, and thus as Gomorrah. And we can't forget, folks, this is so important. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, 31 and 32, which is a, by the way, Deuteronomy 32 is a prophecy of Israel's last days, her latter end. Okay, so in Israel's last days, in her last end, it says she will become the vine of Sodom. Well, guess what? The contemporary situation in Isaiah chapter 1 shows that they were on their way to being that even in Isaiah's day, and they would most assuredly be that in her last days. And by the way, I think that helps us to understand the identity of Babylon in Revelation, because Babylon in Revelation was spiritually called Sodom. Who is spiritually called Sodom in Isaiah 1:10? Jerusalem. Who is being likened to Sodom in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9? Jerusalem. That's a consistent testimony concerning that, not only the metaphor, but the identification of Jerusalem as Sodom. William, you and I have talked about this an awful lot privately and lots of discussions. To me, this is such powerful evidence for the identity and for the interpretation of the book of Revelation. William, are you there? I'm wondering if William decided to take another nap. I tell you, the guy just works so hard. William, are you there? Okay. Well, I shall continue then. So, in Isaiah chapter 3, notice this metaphor. They declare their sin as Sodom. Now, what is the point of that here? They are not ashamed of their sin. They have no humility. There is an arrogance about them. There is a pride about them. Now, when we look at the New Testament record, during the days of Jesus, during his ministry, just ask yourself the question, if that does not fit very aptly so the leadership of the Sanhedrin, the leadership of the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not aware of a New Testament text that specifically cites or quotes Isaiah 3:9, but certainly the theme of the arrogance and the pride and the haughtiness of the leaders of Jerusalem is such that it makes you say, well, wow, that fits. There's no question about it. That fits. So I just want you to see that comparison there. Now, I think William may have returned. Did you make it back, William? Well,
can you hear me?
Okay. I can hear you. You disappeared for a while.
No, I've been here all the time.
Are you there?
It's something wrong with my mic. I have to unplug it and plug it back in.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe it was taking another nap.
No. No,
Okay.
I didn't realize that my mic had stopped working until you called me a minute ago, and then I started checking it. But that's what the problem was. I had to unplug it and restart it.
Okay, my mic did that with me here at the house. I was trying to talk to somebody just the other day, and I had unplugged it so that we could listen to the sound on the computer. When I plugged it back in, I had no sound whatsoever, and I don't even know what happened. But anyway, back in Isaiah chapter 3, I want everyone to notice. Now, folks, I keep reminding us of this, but this is so critical. Remember, this is in the last days, during the period of time in which the Messianic Temple would be established, in the last days. Now, we begin with the time frame in the last days, and we have the interjection of the great day of the Lord's wrath, to use that terminology, in verses 10 through 12, verses 19 through 21. And then we have those constant references to in that day. Now, what I've been trying to show you, what William and I have been sharing with you, is that this last days period would be a time of famine, a time of difficulty, a time of judgment. I'm going to begin reading with verse 13 now to illustrate that. The Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof, for you have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean? Or what mean you that beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts. Now, I want to comment on verse 15 here in a moment. But, William, I've got a question for you. I've been pondering this question actually for a couple of weeks because this term kind of jumped off the page at me. Verse 14, the Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people. What is your take on the ancients?
I'm just kind of amused by the question. You say you've been pondering it for 2 weeks, and you want me to take 2 seconds and figure it out.
I think that's very fair.
I only wish I had been sitting at my other computer. I would have taken that challenge very easily, because then I could have looked it up so quickly and told you.
Well, yeah, I understand. I'm going to look up very, very quickly this text and do a comparison of English translations. It says, let me hear it. The elders of the people, elders and princes. So they seem to be taking this as simply the older men of the people.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
In context.
Yeah. That's what seems to be the consensus of the translations. I'm looking at like 59 different translations. And by far, the preponderant translation is the elders of his people. The reason that I ask that is because that term ancients can refer to the forefathers like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I did not take the time when that term jumped off the page at me, which is in the New King James translation, by the way, folks. When that term jumped off the page at me, I thought, I've got to do some research on that. I've got to see if that could possibly be a prediction of resurrection. And one of the reasons that concept jumped off the page at me is not only because of the terminology of the ancients of his people, but in Isaiah chapter 24, which is an eschatological prophecy of the last days, it is most assuredly a prophecy of the day of the Lord. It's the destruction of heaven and earth. Isaiah 24:19 and following. But in Isaiah 24:21 and following, it reads like this: It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. They shall be gathered together as prisoners are shut up in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison, and after many days they shall be visited. And then, of course, it's the prediction of Yahweh ruling on Mount Zion. But here we have the kings of the earth with the host on high. Now, that terminology of the host on high normally has reference to the angelic, if you want to use that term, but with the spiritual world, the spiritual beings, those in the heavenly realm, so to speak. And so here is the Lord saying, He shall punish the host of the high ones that are on the high. Now, I do understand that terminology can also refer to kings, exalted individuals. So it's not 100% certain that he is referring to the judgment of angels, spiritual beings, and what have you. But he goes ahead to say, I'm going to punish the host of the high ones that are on high and the kings on the earth, upon the earth. Now, we have a couple of choices here. This is either a Hebrew parallelism, in which case it would mean that the host of the high ones that are on high is simply another way of expressing the kings on the earth. That's distinctly possible that it is a Hebrew parallelism. If it's not a parallelism, then the host of the high ones that are on high are in fact different from the kings of the earth. Have you ever studied that enough, William, to make up your mind about what that is?
I have not. Interesting.
It has been interesting to me for a good long while. I have not been able to satisfy myself as to whether this terminology, the host of the high on high, so to speak, uh, is just the kings, another terminology, a poetic expression for the kings of the earth, and this being a parallelism. I just simply haven't been satisfied in my own mind with what this is. But I see a little bit of an echo of Isaiah chapter 3 here in chapter 21. I mean, this is so interesting. They who? The host of the high ones on high and the kings, they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit. They shall be shut up in prison. After many days they shall be visited. Well, that sure sounds like Revelation chapter 20 to me. That sounds like the binding of Satan and his angels for the millennium. So this is part of the stuff this is what has gone through my mind as I have compared these passages with one another, trying to get a little bit better handle on exactly what it was that was being foretold. Now, we already know Isaiah chapter 3 is in the last days. We know Isaiah 24 is for the last days. We know that Isaiah chapter 3 climaxes in the day of the Lord. We know Isaiah 24 climaxes in the day of the Lord. So the only real question that remains is he using this language of the high ones on high to speak of the spiritual world and conquering the principalities and the powers in the heavenly places, along with the ancients of the people, perhaps meaning something a little bit more than simply the elders of the people? I don't know. To me, it's an interesting subject, but whatever that might be, didn't mean to get too far off subject there. Whatever that might be, we're still in the last days, as we have emphasized. Verse 14, the Lord will enter into judgment with his people. Folks, there's no way out of it. Here is a last days text, the last days in which the Messianic Temple would be built, and it is a time of judgment on Israel. Now, this poses some real difficulties for the dispensational view. When you talk about the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation, I have written on several different occasions that it is absolutely improper to try to divorce the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation from covenantal wrath. Covenantal wrath against Israel for violating Torah. And the reason I say that is because the abomination of desolation would be placed in the holy place. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 and following. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let him who reads understand, standing in the holy place, and Luke says, standing where it ought not, then let those who are in Judea flee. Point of it is, whatever the abomination of desolation was, it is important for us to see that it's a covenantal issue. It is something that happens. I am personally convinced that it's something that Israel did that resulted in their desolation, because the literal Hebrew and the literal Greek is, or the force of it, I should say, is the abomination that brings or that causes desolation. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that I reject the idea that the abomination of desolation refers to the Romans. No, the abomination would be such an egregious sin against God that he would cause the desolation of judgment to come on Israel who had committed the abomination. And so this is critical. By the way, I developed this in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12. future or fulfilled. But I think this is an extremely, extremely important point. When the dispensationalists tell us, okay, the Messianic Temple will be rebuilt at the beginning of the tribulation period, immediately after the rapture. Okay, what causes then the Great Tribulation? They tell us, well, it's something done by this pagan, non-Jewish man of sin who sets himself up in that temple, calls himself God. That doesn't work. If, in fact, it is the abomination that brings desolation, that causes desolation, then a pagan is not the one that would commit the abomination for which God would bring a desolation on the temple. That's a violation of the meaning of the abomination that brings desolation. That's not what that means, in other words. And so, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm teaching on that. One of the things is to look at the parallels from the Old Testament and what happened prior to the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. There were several abominations that were committed by Israel in the temple, excuse me, and involving the worship of idols, etc., that caused the event that happened in the following chapter. So if you look in Ezekiel 8 and 9, you find some clues that I think support the fact that the abomination of desolation was committed by Israel as opposed to the pagans.
Oh, I agree 100% because in Ezekiel chapter 8, when you begin to discuss there, begin to talk, Ezekiel 8 is the passage that came immediately to mind because in Ezekiel chapter 8, they were worshiping the goddess or the god of Tammuz. And, I got to confess, I just don't get this. They were eating mice and worshiping mice. Sorry, I don't get the attraction there. I mean, I think you could even barbecue a mouse, and I still wouldn't want to eat it. I just don't. It just truly makes you wonder how some of those ancient idolatrous practices ever sprang up, how they ever gained any following. I mean, honestly, seriously, why could anyone worship mice? Those little bitty rodents. I mean, were women in the ancient times not as frightened of mice as modern women are? William, I don't know about Leora. I suspect I do because she's a woman. I have never seen a woman that wasn't just absolutely teetotally 100% terrified at a mouse. Now, that may be modern culturalization. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, most of them I've ever known have been, and I mean, it frightens and terrifies them.
I've seen my wife literally climb on the back of a couch and stand on the back of a couch because a mouse ran across the floor. If she would have had a gun, she probably would have shot in the house trying to kill it. But it makes you wonder if that's culturalization, and if those ancient women were not frightened of mice. Maybe they were around them so much. Maybe they were so common. I don't know what the deal was. But again, and that may be the modern perspective, projecting back into the ancient times. But again, it's beyond my capability of comprehension to understand how anyone could actually worship mice or rats, or for that matter, alligators or whatever else they, like the ancient Egyptians worshiped the alligators. So, but the point that you were making is exactly the point that I was trying to emphasize. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC was caused by the leaders at Jerusalem going into the temple itself, looking to the east, worshiping the god, I think it's actually a female goddess, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while. The goddess of Tammuz, and eating mice, worshiping mice. And so in chapter 9 and following, rest of the book of Ezekiel, a whole lot of it is about the fall of Jerusalem. Israel committed such an abomination, such a violation of Torah, that God destroyed the temple. Okay, so when we come to the dispensational view of the Jerusalem temple, then Israel signs a peace treaty with the man of sin. They build the temple. According to the dispensational view, it's this non-Jewish, pagan, Gentile man of sin that sets up an abominable sacrifice, abominable idol in the altar and begins the Great Tribulation. But according to the dispensational view, and by the way, Thomas Ice is quite adamant on this, the Great Tribulation is in no way whatsoever a covenantal judgment on Israel of any kind. It is a Gentile persecution. Well, that completely misses the point of the covenantal judgments. Covenantal judgments on Israel were, in fact, Gentile oppression, Gentile invasion, Gentile destruction of Jerusalem or the outlying cities. And so when Thomas Ice tries to tell us, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 was not a covenantal judgment in any way whatsoever. And, of course, by the way, I should point out, he turns around and directly contradicts that and says that the events of the fall of Jerusalem in Luke 20, as recorded in Luke chapter 21, was the complete fulfillment of all of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the day of vengeance against Jerusalem. And if anyone wants that quote, I'll be more than happy to provide it. But Thomas Ice says on the one hand, it's not a covenantal judgment. On the other hand, it is a covenantal judgment. It is a massive self-contradiction in the dispensational paradigm. What we're asking people to do tonight is to examine your doctrine, examine the doctrine of the millennial temple to see if it agrees with Isaiah chapter 3 that in the last days it would be a time of judgment from God on Israel due to her sin. Now, here's a question that has to be asked. In the dispensational paradigm, is the Great Tribulation a judgment from God for Israel's sin? And the answer to that is, in the dispensational paradigm, no, it's not. They are basically innocent victims. They were deceived by the man of sin. It wasn't their fault. They were not wicked. They were not adulterous and idolatrous. They were just deceived. They fell for the man of sin and his sales pitch. That doesn't fit either the abomination of desolation or the Great Tribulation, both of which, as we just pointed out, biblically speaking, are judgments. Number one, the abomination is the sin of Israel in the temple. Number two, the Great Tribulation and the judgment by a pagan Gentile force is God's judgment on Israel for her abominations. You see, that's what's happening in Isaiah chapter 3. So if anyone wants to talk about the last days and the establishment of the Messianic Temple, by going to Isaiah chapter 2, you can't overlook chapter 3, which specifically and emphatically posits that last days period of time as a period of Israel's wickedness, Israel's sin, Israel being as bad as Sodom, and judgment coming on Judah and Jerusalem for her sin at the time when God would stand up to judge Jerusalem and Judah. Because, notice Isaiah 3:14. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of the people, with the princes thereof, for you have eaten the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. Now, we're not going to be able to get to the poor and the issue of the poor here, all right? But, folks, if you're listening, your assignment before next week is to read James chapter 5, 2 and 5, I should say. James chapter 2 and 5, as well as Matthew chapter 23, and to see if you find any issues there that matches what Yahweh in Isaiah chapter 3 said would take place in the last days. But notice, as we close this evening, you have eaten up the vineyard. Folks, that is talking about the vineyard here in Isaiah is Israel, Isaiah chapter 5. And the leaders of Israel are held responsible for leading Israel into sin, the sin that would bring Yahweh's judgment on them. So if you're going to posit the last days as the time of the building of the Messianic Temple, you have to deal with Isaiah chapter 3, which says in the last days, Israel's sin would be so great that it would bring God's judgment on her, a judgment of famine, a judgment of Judah and Jerusalem. And folks, that's all we've got time for this evening. Thank you so very, very much for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, as always, been great to be with you. Get some rest, my friend. You got a lot to do. Good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say, have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.